The moment I walked into room 4B of the Ottawa courthouse, my son looked up from his notes and smirked. Not the warm kind. The kind a card player makes when he thinks he's holding all the aces. His wife didn't look up at all. She was scrolling her phone, one manicured thumb sweeping lazily across the screen, as though she were choosing a restaurant, not watching her father-in-law walk into a room where they intended to take everything he owned. Justice Forsyth entered from the side door. She settled into her chair, opened the day's docket, and put on her reading glasses. Then she looked up to confirm the respondent was present. She found me. The glasses came off. Her face went the color of old snow. A ballpoint pen rolled from her fingers and clattered against the edge of the bench. She gripped the armrest with both hands and leaned forward, and into the microphone she had apparently forgotten was live. She said a single name in a voice meant to be a whisper. The ledger. My son's smirk dissolved. He looked at the judge, then at me, then back at the judge, utterly lost. His wife had finally put down her phone. They had convinced themselves they were putting a confused old man in a cage. They had no idea what they had actually started. It began, as these things often do, over a dinner that pretended to be something warmer than it was. I am Rupert Colquhoun. I am 67 years old. I am a widower. 7 years ago, Agnes, my wife of 31 years, died of pancreatic cancer in a bed at the Ottawa General Hospital, with my hand in hers and a January storm pressing against the windows outside. When she was gone, I did what I thought she would have wanted. I sold our house on Sunnyside Avenue, the one with the big maple out front and the cracked porch step we'd always meant to fix, and I bought the garden suite attached to my son's house in Canada. Self-contained, private entrance, its own small kitchen. I wanted to be near family. I wanted to watch my grandson grow up. What I did not anticipate was becoming furniture. My son, Barrett, is 42 years old. He builds things. Or rather, he arranges for other people's money to build things and calls himself a developer. His wife, Odette, manages what she calls her lifestyle brand, which as far as I can tell means photographing herself in expensive clothing and posting the results on the internet for strangers to admire. They live in a house with more bathrooms than I have years left to use them. The Sunday dinner that changed everything was in late November. I'd stomped the frost from my boots at the back door and found them already seated. My grandson, Rowan, 14 years old, the only person in that house who still looked at me as though I mattered, was at the far end of the table. He waved. Grandpa, I've got a hockey tournament in Gatineau next weekend. You want to come? Before I could answer, my son cut across him without looking up from his phone. Rowan, don't bother your grandfather. He needs his rest. My daughter-in-law laughed, a light, practiced sound. He's right, sweetheart. Let Grandpa be. They had decided, between them, what I could manage. They discussed the Canada condo project, a 16-story tower near the old Nortel campus, and Odette's upcoming charity gala, all while I sat there the way you'd sit beside a lamp, present, inanimate, ignored. I pushed a piece of roasted parsnip around my plate and thought about Agnes, who would have said something sharp and funny that broke the tension without drawing blood. I said nothing, because I had mistaken my silence for dignity. I see now it was simply permission. 3 days later, my son knocked on the garden suite door and came in before I answered, which is a habit of men who don't expect to be told no. He sat across from me with the easy confidence of someone closing a deal. He told me the Canada project was going beautifully, that the pre-sales were strong, that the building permit had cleared. Then he leaned forward and dropped his voice to the register he used when he wanted to seem serious. Dad, I've hit a small cash flow gap, just temporary. The financing is solid, but we need to show additional liquidity to one of the lenders before the next draw. I need a bridge of $400,000. 6 months. I'll return it with a 10% premium. $40,000 clean profit for you, secured against the project. He was smooth. He had always been smooth. But I watched his face and noticed what he couldn't hide, the faint sheen on his temples, the slight tightness around the jaw. Son, I said, I'm 67. Agnes's illness in the last years of my career used up my appetite for financial risk. My money is for my medical care and my old age. The answer is no. The smoothness left him immediately. What replaced it was colder. Unbelievable. He stood slowly, as though containing himself required physical effort. You live here on our property. You won't help your own family? He walked to the door and stopped. You'll regret this. I want you to know that. The door closed behind him, and I sat in the blue chair. Agnes had reupholstered the year before she was diagnosed, and tried to understand when my only son had become a stranger. 6 weeks later, I understood. It was a Tuesday in February, just past 2 in the morning. I'd woken thinking I heard my car battery. Someone had warned me that cold snaps that severe could drain one overnight, and I went out to check. The driveway was black ice under a skim of new snow. I didn't see it until I was already falling. I hit the pavement hard. My hip took most of it. I lay there in the dark, testing whether anything was broken, the cold settling in fast and absolute. I could move my legs. The pain was serious, but not structural. I tried to get up and couldn't. The ice gave me nothing to push against. I called my son. He answered on the third ring, thick with sleep. I told him what had happened. I told him I was on the driveway and couldn't get up. A pause. Then, Dad, call 911. I've got a flight to Vancouver at 6. Call 911 and they'll sort you out. The line went dead. I lay on that driveway for 28 minutes waiting for the ambulance. The lights in the main house did not come on. Not once. Not a curtain moved. It was a badly bruised hip and some deep swelling. They kept me at the Ottawa Civic overnight for observation and sent me home with a cane the next morning. When the cab pulled into our street that afternoon, my son's car was still in the driveway. He had not, in the end, made that 6 o'clock flight to Vancouver. He had simply not come outside. I went back to the blue chair and sat in it for a long time. And I understood something that I should have understood sooner. They did not see me as a person requiring care. They saw me as a problem that had not yet been fully solved. The envelope arrived 11 days later. A registered letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. A courier who took my signature with professional indifference and was gone before I'd finished reading the return address. I opened it at my kitchen table. It was a petition to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. The applicants were Barrett Colquhoun and Odette Colquhoun. The respondent was me. They were seeking a guardianship of property order under the Substitute Decisions Act, a legal declaration that I was no longer capable of managing my own finances. They were claiming cognitive incapacity. Attached as Exhibit A was a psychological assessment from one Dr. Cyril Bromley, Ph.D. He concluded in careful clinical language that I exhibited significant cognitive decline, an inability to assess financial risk, and paranoid ideation regarding my family's intentions. He recommended immediate intervention. Dr. Cyril Bromley, a name I had never encountered in my life. I set the papers down. I walked across the driveway, carefully because of the ice, and knocked on the back door. They were in the kitchen. My son was at the island with the coffee. Odette was loading the dishwasher. Both went still when they saw what I was holding. My son recovered first. He set down his mug and arranged his face into the expression of a man delivering difficult news he has rehearsed thoroughly. Dad, we were planning to sit down with you before the hearing, to explain. Explain this, I said, and placed the petition on the island between us. He spread his hands. It's for your protection. After the fall, after everything, you're not as sharp as you were. You're alone. You're making financial decisions that concern us. We're your family. We're trying to look after you. You left me on the ice, I said, for 28 minutes. Odette glanced at my son. Something shifted in her face, not guilt, closer to irritation. We didn't know it was that serious, she said. My son leaned forward, and for just a moment the careful son, who his worried performance cracked. You want the truth? You could have solved everything with one phone call to your bank. Instead, you made this a problem. This is what happens. He picked up his coffee and walked out of the kitchen. Odette followed, without looking back. I returned to the garden suite. I locked the door, and then I went to my closet, moved the winter coats that hung at the back, and pressed my thumb to the biometric lock that nobody in the main house had ever noticed. The room I stepped into was not large. 3 monitors, a secure filing cabinet, an encrypted terminal I'd had installed years ago and never dismantled, a wall of flat archival files going back to 1989. The air was cool and still and smelled faintly of the lamp oil Agnes used when we worked late in our early years together. My son believed I was a retired federal accountant who had spent 35 years auditing government contracts, a paper man who had aged into irrelevance. He was half right about the paper. For 22 years, I was a senior analyst with the RCMP's Integrated Market Enforcement Team, the unit the country sends in when financial fraud isn't merely large, it's structurally impossible to understand. I did not simply follow the money. I rebuilt the buildings it had been hidden inside. I was the one they brought in when the records had been deliberately scrambled, when the trail had been salted to lead nowhere. They called me the Ledger. In 2001, I spent 4 months reconstructing the financial records of the Holbrook Capital fraud, a $340 million securities scheme that had destroyed the retirement savings of thousands of Canadians. The Crown's case was collapsing. Their star witness had recanted. Their evidence was a tangle of deliberate misdirection. I came in, mapped the money across 11 shell corporations and 4 offshore accounts, and handed the Crown prosecutor a case she could actually argue in front of a jury. That Crown prosecutor was 34 years old at the time. Her name was Catherine Forsyth. She had been a justice for 12 years. I sat down at the console. I picked up the secure line. I dialed a number I had not used in 4 years, the direct number of Amara Diallo, daughter of a former RCMP colleague, now in private practice in Ottawa after 8 years with the Department of Justice, prosecuting financial crimes. She answered on the second ring. "Amara," I said. "It's Rupert Colquhoun. I worked with your father on the Pemberton matter in 2009. I need counsel, today." A pause, not hesitation, calibration. "My father mentions your name. What's happened?" "My son and daughter-in-law have petitioned for guardianship of my property. They're claiming cognitive incapacity. I need someone who knows how to take one of these apart." The pause that followed was shorter. "I'll be there at 2, she said. She arrived exactly on time, dark coat, slim briefcase, her father's methodical eyes. She stepped into my office, looked once around the room, and gave a small nod that meant she had already understood several things she hadn't needed explained. "Their expert is a Dr. Cyril Bromley," I said, sliding the petition across the desk. She scanned it, opened her briefcase, typed the name into a secure database. "Give me an hour," she said. She called me back in 40 minutes. "He's not a psychologist," she said. Her voice had the careful flatness of someone delivering news that is going to be useful. "He was a psychiatrist, registered with the CPSO until 5 years ago. His license was permanently revoked in 2019. "On what grounds?" "Billing fraud, submitting claims to OHIP for sessions that never took place, and what the college described as an inappropriately permissive prescribing practice for controlled substances. He was writing opioid prescriptions for patients he'd never examined. They called it gross professional misconduct." She paused. "But that's not the part you need to hear yet." I waited. 4 years ago, Bromley was facing 8 counts of fraud, bail set at $80,000. He didn't have it. A corporate bail guarantee was arranged. I looked up the guarantor. Another pause, precise in its timing. "The company is 2847193 Ontario Inc. Sole Director, Barrett Colquhoun." I let the silence sit. My son had not found a corrupt expert last month. He had been keeping one in reserve for 4 years. He had covered the man's bail, likely his legal costs, and in doing so had acquired a compromised professional who would sign whatever was placed before him, because the alternative was having someone know exactly what kind of favor he owed my son. This was not impulsive. "There's more," Amara said. "Do you want it now?" "Now," I said. I needed to find the rest myself. I turned to the monitors and began with my son's development company, Colquhoun Development Group, Inc. He had done the basics correctly. Parent company held by a family trust, the trust directing a numbered holding company, the holding company owning the project. Not stupid, but he was leveraged. I pulled the personal property security registry and the land titles records for the Canada project. The primary lender was a firm called Meridian Ridge Capital, a private equity lender based in Toronto. Private lenders like Meridian Ridge don't finance stable projects. They finance desperate ones, at interest rates that reflect exactly how desperate. The registered loan amount was $6.2 million. I cross-referenced the construction lien registry. In Ontario, unpaid contractors can file a lien against a property. There were 11 of them, 11 contractors and suppliers, totaling just over $900,000 in unpaid invoices. My son's project was not experiencing a small cash flow gap. It was failing. The building was half finished. The trades were walking off the job, and his primary lender had almost certainly been misled about the state of the work. Then I found the piece that answered the question I had not thought to ask. I called the bank in Ottawa that managed the Agnes Colquhoun Foundation for Pancreatic Cancer Research. Agnes had wanted a foundation, she'd said, in her final months, that she wished something good could come from what had happened to her. After she was gone, I established it with a founding gift of $2.3 million, designated for pancreatic cancer research. I had appointed Odette as managing director, because she had seemed at the time to want purpose. I retained founders' oversight rights and had never once exercised them. I invoked them now and asked for a full transaction statement for the previous 18 months. The statement arrived in my encrypted inbox 8 minutes later. The total assets should have been just over $1.8 million. The figure on the screen was $640,000. I scrolled slowly through the transactions. The legitimate disbursements were there: grants to the University of Ottawa's research program, contributions to the Ottawa Regional Cancer Foundation, and then the others. A payment of $120,000 to something called Colquhoun Development Consulting, Inc., a company I had never heard of. Registry search, sole director, Barrett Colquhoun. Incorporated 4 months after Meridian Ridge had first flagged the project as at risk. A payment of $60,000 to Premier Occasions Ottawa, listed as billing for the charity gala. Registry search, sole director, Odette Colquhoun. The company had been incorporated 7 weeks before the invoice date. My son had billed my wife's charity for consulting on a project that was already collapsing. My daughter-in-law had billed the same charity to plan a party she was organizing anyway. Between them, they had removed $180,000 from a fund established in Agnes's memory, bearing Agnes's name, designated for cancer research. I opened the scanned images of the authorizing checks. The signature on every one of them was Odette's. Clear, unhurried. A signature that belonged to someone signing papers as a matter of routine administration, not someone being coerced. I had told myself, until that moment, that she was weak, that she was being steered. I had been ready to believe she was a secondary problem. I looked at her signature on a check drawn on my dead wife's foundation, made payable to her own shell company, and understood that I had been wrong. I called Amara. Change of approach, I said. We are not defending against this petition. We are ending it, entirely. What did you find? Agnes's foundation, $180,000 gone. Disbursements to companies my son and daughter-in-law own directly. Her signatures on every check. They used my wife's money raised in her name for cancer patients, to pay for this attack. The line was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, Rupert. I need you to find the exact default position with Meridian Ridge Capital, I said. Outstanding amount, terms, whether the acceleration clause has been triggered. She had the information within the hour. My son was 60 days behind on an interest payment. The acceleration clause had been triggered. The full $6.2 million was callable on demand. Meridian Ridge had already instructed lawyers to begin enforcement proceedings. I thought about it for one night. In the morning, I instructed Amara to approach Meridian Ridge with a proposal. I would purchase the outstanding note at full par value through a blind trust, giving them a clean exit from a deteriorating situation. No paper trail connecting the buyer to the borrower's family. Private lenders are pragmatic. When a solvent buyer offers to assume a toxic note at full value and absorb the collection problem entirely, the calculation is not a difficult one. The transfer was completed in 48 hours through a trust account Amara established. My son believed he was in default to a corporate lender in Toronto with no connection to his life. He was in default to me. We walked into room 4B on a Thursday morning in March. The courthouse smelled of old carpet and recycled air. I wore the charcoal suit I'd last put on for testimony before a parliamentary committee in 2018. I had it pressed. I'd had my hair cut the day before. I was not the man they had described in their petition, uncertain, diminished, softened by time. I was the man I had always been. They had simply stopped looking. My son smirked when I walked in. His wife scrolled her phone. Their lawyer, a man named Fitch, from a firm that specialized in elder guardianship cases, sorted his papers with the confidence of someone who has done this many times and expects to do it again. Then Justice Forsyth took her seat. I watched her face the way I used to watch witnesses. Carefully, with patience, waiting for the moment that couldn't be managed. She put on her reading glasses. She looked up to find the respondent. She found me. The glasses came off. The pen rolled from the bench, and her voice, amplified by the microphone she had forgotten was live, said the name I had not used in 4 years. Every head turned. My son looked at the judge, then at me, then at his lawyer. His lawyer looked at the judge. Nobody had an explanation. Justice Forsythe recovered herself. She straightened her papers, composed her expression, and set her face back into judicial neutrality. But when she looked at the petitioner's table, her eyes were not neutral at all. The hearing proceeded. Fitch called Dr. Bromley. He was a small man in a suit that didn't quite fit, with the hunched posture of someone who had been expecting for some time to be confronted. He sat in the witness box and read from a script he had clearly rehearsed. He described my cognitive decline in the careful language of a professional. He recommended immediate guardianship as a matter of urgency. Amara stood up when her turn came. She walked toward the witness box slowly, holding a single sheet of paper. "Good morning," she said, pleasantly. "I'd like to confirm your credentials. You've introduced yourself as Dr. Bromley. What is your current registration with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario?" He shifted in his seat. "I have a background in psychiatry." "Your current registration," Amara said. The pleasantness did not change. "Specifically." He said nothing. "Because I have a document here, CPSO public record, freely available to anyone, indicating that your license to practice medicine in Ontario was permanently revoked in 2019 for billing fraud and for operating what the college described as an inappropriately permissive prescribing practice." She laid the paper on the overhead projector. The image filled the screen. His name, the revocation date, the grounds. "Is this record inaccurate?" Fitch was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Character evidence. This is." "The witness has presented himself to this court as a medical expert," Justice Forsythe said, and her voice had the quality of something that had been waiting for an excuse to be sharp. "His qualifications are directly at issue. Overruled. The witness will answer." Bromley's hands were trembling. He looked at Fitch. Fitch had no help to offer. "Yes," Bromley said, barely audible. "And did you receive a payment of $22,000 from 2847193 Ontario Inc., a company of which Barrett Colhoun is the sole director, 3 days before you signed the assessment submitted to this court?" Fitch objected again, louder. Amara placed the bank transfer record on the projector without changing her expression. The figure on the wall was clear to everyone in the room. Justice Forsythe looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she looked at Bromley. Then she said, quietly, to the bailiff, "Please take this man into custody. He has committed perjury in this courtroom and filed a fraudulent document with this court. The Crown will be notified." The sound of the handcuffs was very loud in a suddenly silent room. My son had gone the color of old concrete. All the careful preparation, the petition, the expert, the lawyer, had just been led away in handcuffs. Fitch, desperate, put my son on the stand. It was a mistake. My son is a man who believes he can talk his way through almost anything, and he began with practiced steadiness. He was worried about me. He had always been worried about me. The fall, the isolation, the financial decisions that concerned him. He had acted purely out of love. Amara let him run for 2 minutes. Then she stood. "Mr. Colhoun, you've described your father as financially incapable, confused, unable to assess risk. Is that accurate?" "That's correct." "And yet 4 months ago, you asked this same financially incapable man to lend you $400,000. A pause. "I was trying to include him, to give him an opportunity. You asked a man you believed to be confused and paranoid for $400,000. Her voice was level. "When he said no, you initiated guardianship proceedings. Is that the sequence of events?" He tried to reframe it. She held the frame. "The Canada Project," she said. "You've described it to this court as sound. Pre-sales strong, financing solid. 11 contractor liens, Mr. Colhoun, filed in the past 6 months. Total value exceeding $900,000. And a callable default notice from your primary lender. Does that describe a sound project with solid financing?" "We've had some delays." "You were bankrupt," she said, "and when your father said no, you needed to find another source." She let a beat pass. The money to retain Mr. Fitch, the $22,000 for Dr. Bromley's signature. Where did that come from? Silence. It came, Amara said, from the Agnes Colquhoun Foundation for Pancreatic Cancer Research, a charitable foundation your father established in your mother's name, a foundation whose checks your wife authorized. She turned for the first time and looked directly at Odette, your wife, whose signatures appear on every disbursement. My daughter-in-law's composure, which had held with remarkable discipline through the morning, broke completely. She stood up, and her voice, when it came, was raw and uncontrolled. He told me those were approved administrative costs. My son turned on her, sharp and low. Don't. He told me it was all properly structured. Don't say another word. You told me it was legitimate. Her voice had climbed to something unfamiliar, all the polished surface gone. You told me every time. You said it was. Justice Forsyth's gavel came down like a gunshot. In the silence that followed, my son stood in the witness box with nowhere to go and nothing left to sell. His wife was crying, not the careful tears of performance, but the ugly, convulsive kind. The room was absolutely still. I looked at my son and found, to my own surprise, that I felt very little, not triumph, not grief. Something closer to the feeling you have when you have finished a long, difficult calculation and the numbers have finally come to rest. I gave a small nod to Amara. She reached into her briefcase and removed a document bound in blue legal covers. She walked it across the aisle, unhurried, not theatrical, and placed it on the table in front of my son. He picked it up. His hands were shaking badly enough that he had difficulty holding it. That, Amara said, is a notice of demand and intention to enforce security. Your primary lender, Meridian Ridge Capital, is no longer your primary lender. That note was purchased at full par value 4 days ago through a blind trust. She paused for exactly 1 second. You are in default on $6.2 million. The acceleration clause has been invoked. The security, the Kanata property, your personal residence, and all assets registered to Colquhoun Development Group, Inc., is subject to immediate enforcement proceedings. My son stared at the document. His mouth opened. No sound came out. You came into this courtroom, Amara said quietly, to take everything your father owns. I would suggest you spend the next hour thinking very carefully about what you own. Justice Forsyth looked at my son for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Mr. Rupert Colquhoun, she said, the petition before me seeks a guardianship of property order on the grounds that you are incapable of managing your financial affairs. Having heard the proceedings this morning, I am dismissing the petition. The conduct of the petitioners is being referred to the Crown. She removed her glasses. I would strongly recommend, Mr. Barrett Colquhoun, that you retain new counsel before noon. She stood. The room stood with her. We're adjourned. The aftermath was not quick, and it was not clean, and there was nothing satisfying about any of the parts that mattered most. Dr. Bromley pled guilty to perjury and fraud. He was already a disgraced man, and there was not much further for him to fall. My son retained a criminal defense lawyer and fought the charges for 9 months before accepting a plea. He was convicted of fraud over $5,000, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of charitable funds. The judge sentenced him to 2 years less a day, to be served in the community, with 240 hours of community service and a restitution order of $180,000 to the foundation. Colquhoun Development Group was wound up. The Kanata project was sold at a loss. The main house went with it. The security I held encompassed the property entirely. My daughter-in-law was charged separately. She had signed the checks, and that fact could not be undone. She pled guilty to misappropriation of charitable funds and received a conditional discharge and 3 years of probation. The sentencing judge added a condition: 500 hours of volunteer service at the Ottawa Mission's Dementia Support Program, not filing papers in an office. Sitting with residents who did not know their own names, who could not find their children's faces in memory, who were genuinely lost in the way she had claimed her father-in-law was. I thought the sentence was just. I thought it was, perhaps, the only education she had ever truly been given. I was asked, more than once, to speak to the Crown about leniency. I declined each time. That was not cruelty. It was consistency. I had spent more than 2 decades in a job where the facts were the facts and the ledger was the ledger, and a man who begins making exceptions for people he loves is a man who stops being of any use to anyone, including the people he loves. Rowan came to see me on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the hearing. He knocked properly and waited for the door to open, which told me more about the kind of person he was becoming than anything I might have said about him. He sat across from me and said without preamble, "I didn't know about any of it. I need you to know that I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "Where are you going?" I told him I'd found a condominium near the Rideau River, top floor, a view Agnes would have liked. Small, manageable mine. "Will I still see you?" he asked, in the careful voice of a 14-year-old, trying not to show that the answer matters. "Every hockey game you'll let me come to," I said, "and I expect a ticket to the Gatineau tournament." He nodded. I knew the nod. I had used it myself 40 years ago when things mattered more than I wanted to admit. The day I packed the last box in the garden suite, my daughter-in-law came to the door. She was wearing clothes I didn't recognize. Plain, inexpensive, the clothes of someone learning to exist without a brand attached to everything she owned. Her hands were rough at the knuckles. The careful architecture of her presentation was gone. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke. "Why didn't you stop us earlier?" she asked. Her voice was flat with exhaustion. "You knew. You're who you are. You could have seen this coming before it got this far. You could have shown us the evidence when he asked for the money. You could have warned me about what he was doing with the foundation. Why did you let it go this far?" I pressed the last strip of tape down on the last box and smoothed it flat with my palm. "Because if I had stopped you before you chose it," I said, "you would have gone back and chosen it again. You would have believed the next thing he told you. You would have found another way to get him what he needed. Another source." I turned to face her. "I didn't let you do anything. I let you be who you were. The distinction matters more than you know." She had no answer. I didn't expect one. I gave her an envelope before she left. Inside was the address of a legal aid clinic that handles financial recovery cases for seniors, and a note in my handwriting: "The Agnes Colquhoun Foundation has been restored to solvency under professional management. If you ever want to do something real with your time, they accept volunteers." Whether she will, I don't know. At 67, I find I am less interested in predicting what people will do than I used to be. What I know is that the books are balanced. The foundation is fully restored, and then some. A trust has been established for Rowan, accessible when he turns 25, enough to give him choices that weren't available to his father. And Agnes's name is on something honest again. I am Rupert Colquhoun. I spent more than 2 decades making certain that numbers told the truth, no matter how many people needed them to lie. I retired. I became invisible. I allowed myself to be diminished by people I loved, because loving someone can make you mistake indulgence for kindness and silence for grace. The ledger of a life, like any ledger, must eventually be balanced. What I learned, lying on a frozen driveway in February with the lights of my son's house dark above me, is that the longer you wait to balance it, the more it costs when you finally do. Mine is settled now. The columns are even. And I am done waiting for anyone's permission to know my own worth.